The morning Lavinia Baker loaded her last trunk onto the back of the Hargrove freight wagon, the dust of Caldwell, Kansas, hung so thick in the September air of 1878 that she could taste it on her teeth, and she told herself she would not look back at the town that had swallowed 4 years of her life and given her nothing but grief and a dead husband's debts in return. She was 26 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with dark auburn hair that she pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat she had purchased off a passing milliner the previous spring. She had good hands, capable hands, the kind of hands that had mended fences, stretched hides, and signed legal documents in the county clerk's office without trembling, even when her heart was hammering in her chest. Her husband, Thomas Baker, had died 11 months ago when a horse kicked him square in the temple during a shoeing gone wrong, and in the months since his death, Lavinia had learned the full, ugly architecture of everything he had hidden from her. Debts to the feed supplier. Debts to the bank. A promissory note to a man named Garfield Pruitt that covered nearly half the value of the small property she had believed was hers outright. She had paid what she could. She had sold the cattle, sold the chickens, sold Thomas's good saddle and his collection of horn-handled knives. She had taken in laundry through the winter and through the spring, her knuckles raw and cracking in the cold, and still the number had not gone to zero fast enough. Garfield Pruitt, a heavy-set man who smelled of pipe tobacco and commercial cologne, had come to the house on 3 separate occasions with his hat in his hands and his lawyer's letter tucked under his arm, and on the 3rd occasion he had made her an offer that was not really an offer at all, more a kind of quiet menace dressed in legal language. She had walked him off her porch herself. By August she had come to the only clear conclusion left to her. She would go to her mother's sister in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory. Aunt Clara had been writing to her for years, letters full of descriptions of the wide valley light and the adobe houses, and a dry heat that was nothing like the clinging, suffocating heat of Kansas summer. Aunt Clara had a business, a small boarding house that served traveling merchants and the occasional family moving west, and she had been asking Lavinia to come and help manage it since Lavinia's wedding day, when she had pressed a folded letter into Lavinia's bouquet hand and whispered that the offer would always stand. So Lavinia had written to Clara. And Clara had written back within 3 weeks, which was fast for the Territory Post, and the letter had said, "Come now. Come before the winter closes the mountain passes. Come and bring whatever you can carry and leave the rest behind because none of it matters once you see this sky." That was how Lavinia Baker found herself standing beside the Hargrove freight wagon at 6 in the morning on a September Tuesday, watching Amos Hargrove tie down the canvas cover over her 2 trunks and a crate of books she had refused to leave behind. She had enough money for the wagon fare to Dodge City, where she would board the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line southwest, and she had a small amount remaining in reserve, hidden in the lining of her traveling coat, which she had sewn herself with a double layer of wool serge. She did not expect Abel Sheridan to come riding down the main street of Caldwell at 6:15 in the morning, but that was exactly what he did. She heard the horse first, a big gray gelding named Cutter that she recognized by his unusual blaze and the particular rhythm of his canter, and then she saw Abel himself, riding with the kind of ease that came from having spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. He was 29 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. He wore a plain canvas duster over a blue shirt, and his hat was the same battered gray felt he had owned since before she had known him. He was a working man, not a pretty one, but there was something about the way he held himself, easy and unhurried even when the situation called for urgency, that had always made Lavinia's attention travel toward him against her better judgment. Abel Sheridan was the foreman of the Callaway Ranch, which sat 6 miles east of town on the South Fork of the Chicaskia River. He had worked that land for 7 years, and he knew every acre of it the way other men knew the inside of their own houses. He had been a friend to Thomas Baker in the early years, a careful, thoughtful friend who had never intruded on their marriage but who had appeared reliably at moments of practical crisis, the way a good neighbor does, to help pull a wagon from the mud or rope a steer that had broken through a fence. After Thomas died, he had come twice to the Baker property, once to offer help with the livestock, and once in the spring to tell her about a lawyer in Wichita who he had heard was honest. She had thanked him both times with careful, measured courtesy and had told him she was managing. She had not told him she was leaving. He pulled Cutter to a stop near the wagon, and the gray gelding blew a long breath through his nose and stamped one foot as if he shared his rider's feelings about the early hour. Abel looked at the wagon. He looked at the two trunks visible beneath the edge of the canvas. He looked at Lavinia. "I heard from Jim Cleary at the post office," he said. "He mentioned you had a large parcel going out on the freight route." "Jim Cleary needs to mind his own concerns," Lavinia said, but without real heat. She pulled her coat straighter. "He mentioned Santa Fe," Abel said. "He should take up professional telegraphy if he is going to carry news so efficiently," Lavinia said. Abel did not smile, but something in the region of his mouth shifted. He stepped down from Cutter in one smooth motion and held the reins loosely in one hand, standing at the edge of the boardwalk. He was taller than she always remembered him being when she had not seen him for a while, which was a thing that always struck her fresh. "You were not going to say anything," he said. "It was not a question." "I did not think it required announcing," she said. "I am not the postmaster. I do not owe the town a departure notice." "You do not owe the town a thing," he said quietly. "I was not speaking for the town." There was a beat of silence between them that was longer and more complicated than it should have been. Amos Hargrove had the good sense to walk around to the other side of his wagon team and give them some appearance of privacy. The street was mostly empty. A dog slept in the shade of the hardware store porch. Somewhere down the block, a woman was sweeping, the sound of her broom a dry, rhythmic whisper. "I am going to my aunt in Santa Fe," Lavinia said, more gently than she had intended. "I have a place there, useful work, and a clean start. There is nothing left here for me, Abel. I have paid what I could and given what I had, and the ground just keeps taking." "I know it," he said. "Then you understand why I am going." "I understand it," he said. He looked at her with those dark, level eyes that had always had the uncomfortable quality of seeing more than she wished to show. "That does not mean I am glad of it." She felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for, or rather she had a name for it and had been carefully refusing to use it. She adjusted the strap of her traveling bag over her shoulder. "I am leaving the territory," she said, and her voice came out steady, which she was proud of. "I am not looking back." He was quiet for a moment. The sun was coming up over the flat eastern edge of the world, burning the sky from gray to copper to a thin, clean gold. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture she recognized as him thinking through what he wanted to say. "Well," he said at last, and the corner of his mouth did move now just barely, "I can ride fast enough to stay in view." She stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I am not asking you to stay," he said. "I am not asking you to change a single plan. I am saying that I have had 7 years on that Callaway spread and a foreman's wages, and not one single thing in the world worth going toward." He looked at her, direct and unadorned. "Till right now." Lavinia Baker was not a woman who was easily undone by words. She had grown up in a practical household in Missouri, the daughter of a carpenter father and a mother who believed that sentiment was something you kept for Sundays and funerals, not the general run of a week. But she felt something shift inside her, some old careful arrangement of herself, and she did not look away from him. "You cannot simply follow a woman across 3 territories," she said. "2, he said. "Kansas and New Mexico. We would pass through the corner of Colorado maybe, depending on the rail route. That is not the point." "I know it is not," he said. "The point is that you are going, and I am telling you honestly, which is the only way I know how to tell anybody anything, that I do not want to watch you go and then spend the rest of whatever I have left wondering." "Wondering what?" He looked at her steadily. "Whether you would have let me try." Amos Hargrove cleared his throat from the other side of the team. "Miss Baker, I need to roll in about 10 minutes if we are going to make the Dodge City timing." Lavinia pulled her eyes from Abel's face. She looked at the wagon, at the trunks, at the road stretching north and west out of town. She thought of Aunt Clara's letter. She thought of the smell of Garfield Prout's tobacco cologne on her porch. She thought of 4 years of Kansas wind and one bad year after. She looked back at Abel Sheridan, who was holding his horse's reins and watching her with the particular stillness of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now prepared to receive whatever answer comes, even the hard one. "You would need to make your own arrangements," she said carefully. "I am not slowing down for anyone." "I would not ask you to," he said. "And I am not promising anything," she said. "I am going to my aunt's boarding house to build a life that is my own. I'm not going anywhere to be someone's wife or someone's something or other." "I am not asking for a promise," he said. "I told you I can ride fast enough to stay in view. That is all I am saying." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds, and then she turned and climbed up onto the freight wagon's bench beside Amos Hargrove, and she looked straight ahead down the road, and she did not tell Abel Sheridan yes, and she did not tell him no, and she did not look back. But she listened, as Amos clicked to the team and the wagon began to roll, and she heard, behind her, the distinct and unmistakable sound of a man mounting a horse. She felt, despite everything, something that might have been the first genuine warm thing she had felt in nearly a year. The road from Caldwell to Dodge City was 2 days of hard travel across the flat Kansas plain, and Lavinia spent the first hour of it absolutely certain that Abel Sheridan had turned back. She was equally certain, by the end of the second hour, that she had not looked back often enough to establish whether she was right. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded on her traveling bag, and she watched the brown and gold landscape unspool ahead of her, the late September grass all gone to amber, the sky above it enormous and indifferent and beautiful the way skies only are when no one tells them to behave. Amos Hargrove was a good traveling companion because he was largely silent. He was a thick, weathered man of 50-something who had been hauling freight on this route for 12 years and had long since run out of anything to say about it. He smoked a short pipe and occasionally remarked on weather or road conditions with the brevity of a man who respects the listener's time. After about 3 hours of travel, when the town of Caldwell was entirely swallowed by the horizon behind them, Amos said, without looking at her, "That Sheridan fellow is still back there." Lavinia did not turn around. "Is he?" "About a quarter mile," Amos said. "Riding easy, not catching up, not falling behind." She kept her eyes forward. "He is a grown man and it is a public road," she said. "Yep," said Amos, and did not speak again for another 2 hours. They stopped at midday near a creek crossing, and Amos unhitched the team to let them drink, while Lavinia spread a cloth on a flat rock and ate the bread and hard cheese and dried apple she had packed. She did not look back at the road. She heard Cutter's hooves approaching, and she heard the gelding drinking at the creek, and after a moment she heard Abel's boots in the dry grass, and then he sat down on a rock about 10 feet from her, not too close, not asking for anything, and he took out a piece of dried meat from his coat pocket and ate it. "You are not going to pretend you are just passing through," she said. "No," he said. "I am riding to Dodge City. After that I will figure out the rest." "The rest," she said. "You mean the train?" "If that is what is required." She looked at him now, across the 10 feet of creek bank. His duster was dusty and his hat brimmed threw shade across his eyes, but she could see them well enough. He looked calm. He always looked calm. She had always found that quality of his either deeply reassuring or deeply irritating, depending on her own state, and right now she was not sure which. "You have a job," she said. "You have a ranch and men who depend on you." "I talked to Cal Calloway last evening," he said. "After I heard about your departure from Jim Cleary. I told him I needed to go." She blinked. "You told him last evening, before you even spoke to me this morning." "I knew where I stood," Abel said simply. "I have known where I stood for a while now. I just did not think I had the right to say it while you were still in the middle of surviving." There was that shifting thing again inside her, that rearrangement of the careful structure she had built. She looked down at her piece of bread. "You barely know me," she said, and it came out less convincingly than she had intended. "I have known you for 4 years," he said. "I watched you turn that property around 3 times over. I watched you keep your dignity in front of Garfield Prout when every man in town would have understood if you had not. I watched you work yourself half to nothing all winter and still show up to Sunday service with your chin up." He paused. "I know you pretty well, Lavinia." She had not heard him use her first name before. He had always been careful about that, calling her Mrs. Baker or Miss Baker once the year of mourning had passed, with the respect that the time required. Her name and his voice had a texture to it that she had not anticipated. "And what am I supposed to do with that information?" she said, not quite managing to keep the edge from softening. "Not a thing," he said. "I am not asking you to do anything with it. I told you this morning how it is. I am staying in view." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the creek, at the light moving on the water. Then she looked at her bread. "I will not wait for you at the station if you fall behind," she said finally. "I would not expect you to," he said, and she could hear that he almost smiled. They did not ride together exactly for the rest of that day, but they were also no longer pretending not to be in the same proximity. When Amos pulled over for the night at a small drover's camp where 3 other freight wagons had stopped, Abel unsaddled Cutter near the edge of the camp and built his own fire, a considerate distance from Lavinia's position near the wagon. But he came over to the main fire when the other travelers had gathered, and he sat across from her, and they talked, along with Amos and a cattle buyer named Rupert Swall, and a woman named Frances Holt who was traveling with her grown daughter to meet her son in Dodge City. Frances Holt was a warm, quick-eyed woman who noticed everything. She looked between Lavinia and Abel with the expression of someone solving an arithmetic problem that has presented itself voluntarily. "Are you two traveling together?" Frances asked, addressing neither of them in particular. "We are traveling in the same direction," Lavinia said. "Same road, same camp, same company," said Abel. "I would say that is together enough for the purposes of the prairie." Frances Holt smiled at her daughter. Her daughter smiled back. Lavinia found, to her intense annoyance, that she was also almost smiling, and she turned her attention firmly to her coffee cup. They reached Dodge City on the afternoon of the second day, coming in from the southeast along the Arkansas River route, and rolling past the stockyards and into the town itself, which in September of 1878 was loud and complicated and smelling powerfully of the cattle trade. Dodge City had built its reputation on the Longhorn drives, and it had not softened yet, though the farmers were beginning to move in from the east, and a certain edging toward civilization was visible in some of the newer storefronts. The Long Branch Saloon was doing its usual business. The Santa Fe Railroad Depot sat at the south edge of town, a busy and utilitarian building with a platform where a half-dozen travelers stood in various states of waiting. Lavinia thanked Amos Hargrove and paid him and watched him drive away into the cattle district. And then she stood on the platform with her 2 trunks and her crate of books and looked at the schedule board. The next train southwest, bound for Las Vegas, New Mexico territory, with stops including Trinidad and Raton, departed the following morning at 7:30. She had enough money for a ticket, a night in the respectable hotel on Front Street that she had read about, and a meal or two. It was not comfortable, but it was sufficient. She was at the ticket window when she heard Abel's voice behind her, talking to the station master about baggage handling for a saddle and a gear roll. She took her ticket and stepped aside without turning around, and she walked to the platform bench and sat down and stared at the rails, silver and indifferent, running southwest toward a life she had not started yet. He came and sat at the far end of the same bench, a respectable distance away, and they sat there in the September afternoon light with the sounds of Dodge City surrounding them, the hammer of a freight gang, the bawling of cattle somewhere near the yards, a piano from somewhere on the other side of Front Street, and she thought about how strange it was that a man she had known for 4 years without really knowing could in the space of 2 days begin to feel like the most solid presence in her immediate world. "Did you buy a ticket?" she asked. "I did," he said. "Same train. Is there another option?" he said. She almost smiled. She was doing that more often than she liked, and she was not sure what to do about it. "The hotel on Front Street is said to be decent," she said. "Clean sheets." "I was thinking the boarding house on 2nd Street," he said. "Cheaper." "That is sensible," she said. "I am a sensible man," he said. "You are following a woman across Kansas to New Mexico territory," she said. "I'm not sure that is the definition of sensible." "No," he agreed. "But it is the definition of something." She looked at him sidelong. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the angles of his face, the line of his jaw, the way his eyes had a warmth in them that was not dramatic or loud, but was simply there, reliable as weather. She had looked at this man in passing 100 times over 4 years and somehow managed not to really look, and now that she had started she found it difficult to stop. "If we are going to continue in this proximity," she said carefully, "you should know that I am not a woman who is charmed by pretty words or grand gestures. I was married to a man who had those qualities in abundance, and look how that concluded." "I know it," he said. "I am saying that if there is something between us, if I were to allow there to be something between us, it would need to be honest. I cannot survive another elaborate performance." "Lavinia," he said, and again her name in his voice had that particular texture. "I do not know how to perform. I said it this morning, and I mean it the same way now. I know where I stand. I am not in a hurry, and I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give. I would just like to be near you if you will permit it." She was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of cowboys cross the street with the particular loose-limbed walk of men who have been in a saddle since before dawn. She thought about the last 11 months. She thought about the clean, empty future waiting in Santa Fe, the boarding house with Aunt Clara's capable hands running it, the wide valley like Clara always described. She thought about what it might mean to bring this man into that future. She thought about what it might mean not to. "You may walk me to my hotel," she said at last. He stood up without making a production of it, and he picked up her traveling bag before she could object, and they walked together down Front Street in the amber September light of Dodge City, not touching, not close enough to touch, but walking at the same pace in the same direction, which is, she thought, perhaps how all the important things begin. She slept better that night than she had in months, and in the morning she was ready at the depot at 6:45, and Abel was already there, leaning against the platform railing with his hat pushed back and 2 cups of coffee from the depot kitchen in his hands. He handed her one without commentary. She took it. "Thank you," she said. "Good morning," he said. And that, she thought, might have been the most straightforward and reassuring exchange she had experienced in several years. The train out of Dodge City was a Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe locomotive pulling 6 cars southwest into the territory, and Lavinia had a seat in the second passenger car, near the window, with the New Mexico territory pulling itself toward her from the other side of the glass. The landscape changed as they moved southwest, the flat Kansas wheat country giving way to the broken, reddening terrain of southern Colorado, and then the high approaches of the Raton Pass, the engine laboring up the grade with tremendous noise and effort, the mountains coming in around them with a cold, clean authority that nothing flat can replicate. Abel sat across the aisle from her, which was proper, and for much of the morning they read their respective materials, she one of her crated books, a novel by George Eliot she had been meaning to finish for 2 years, and he a newspaper he had bought in Dodge City. But as the mountains climbed and the passes narrowed, they drifted into conversation without particularly deciding to. He asked her about Santa Fe. She described what she knew from Clara's letters, the old plaza, the palace of the governors, the way the Sangre de Cristo Mountains sat against the eastern sky in the mornings. He listened well. He did not fill the spaces with his own voice when he did not have something worth saying, which was a quality she had not known to miss until she encountered it. She asked him about the Callaway Ranch, about what 7 years on one spread of land felt like. He thought about the question seriously before he answered, which she appreciated. "It feels like a borrowed life," he said after a moment, looking out the window at the climbing mountains. "A good enough life, a life I was grateful for, but borrowed. It was Cal's land, Cal's cattle, Cal's vision. I kept it well, but I was keeping someone else's thing." "What would your own thing look like?" she asked. He was quiet again, that good quiet of his, the thinking kind. "Land that produces something, not too large. Somewhere the water runs reliable and the soil gives back what you put into it. Something to pass on, eventually. Something with permanence to it." "New Mexico Territory has land," she said, and then caught herself because that was a more direct statement than she had intended to make, and they both knew it. He looked at her across the aisle. "It does," he said simply. She returned to her novel, but she was aware of the warmth across the aisle, and she read the same paragraph 4 times. They crossed into New Mexico Territory at Raton Pass in the early afternoon, the train descending from the high gap into the upper Mora Valley, and the country below them opened out into something extraordinary. A high, dry, enormous landscape of mesas and canyon edges and distant mountain ranges stacked blue and purple behind each other to the horizon. The autumn light in New Mexico was different from Kansas light, more saturated, more golden, striking the red earth at an angle that made everything look slightly more vivid than the world had any obligation to be. Lavinia pressed her hand to the window glass and looked out and felt something in her chest open up the way a room feels when you pull back its curtains and let the light in. "Oh," she said softly. "Yes," said Abel, who was looking at it too. They pulled into Las Vegas, New Mexico Territory, in the early evening, and from there they would need to make the final leg of the journey to Santa Fe by stage, which ran daily and covered the roughly 60 miles of the Camino Real in about 12 hours of hard road. Lavinia arranged for her trunks to be held at the Las Vegas depot until they could be sent on, and she booked herself a seat on the morning stage, and she found a room at the Montezuma Hotel, which was a large, reasonably respectable establishment that served the rail trade. Abel arranged a room at the same hotel, which was the logical thing to do since it was the main hotel in town, and which Lavinia chose not to make any remark about. At dinner in the hotel dining room, which was crowded with travelers and a few local businessmen, they sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and it was the first time they had sat face to face for a proper meal, and Lavinia found that the experience of eating across from Abel Sheridan was more domestic and comfortable and pleasant than she had any particular right to expect it to be. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Missouri, outside of Springfield, the second of 4 boys. His father had been a farmer and a good one. His oldest brother still worked the family land. He had come west at 22 because Missouri had felt too small and he had wanted to see what the country was made of at its edges. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, her father's carpentry shop, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil that she associated with childhood safety. She told him about meeting Thomas Baker at a church social when she was 20 and marrying him at 22 and following him to Kansas with a set of copper pots and a belief in the future that the years had worked steadily on. "I do not regret the marriage entirely," she said, because she believed in honesty even when it was complicated. There were good years. He was not a wicked man. He was a careless one. There is a difference. "There is," Abel agreed. "But I will not make decisions from loneliness again," she said, and looked at him directly, because she needed him to understand this. "Whatever I do next, it will be because I want it, not because I need someone to hold the roof up." "I am not offering to hold your roof up," he said. "I would not presume. I am offering, if you will permit me to be direct, my company, my friendship. And if you find that you want more than that at some point, I will be there. And if you do not, I will still be glad I came." She held his gaze for a moment. Outside the hotel window, the sky over Las Vegas was going from deep blue to black, the first stars coming in over the mountains, and the air coming through the slightly open window was high and cold and clean, the smell of piñon pine on it from somewhere. "You are an unusual man, Abel Sheridan," she said. "I have been told I am persistent," he said. "I was going to say honest," she said. "It is rarer than persistence, in my experience." He smiled then, a proper smile, and it transformed his face in a way that she found extraordinarily inconvenient. She took a very precise and deliberate interest in her supper plate. The stage to Santa Fe left Las Vegas at 5 in the morning, before the sun was properly up, and it was a Concord coach with 6 passengers, and a driver named McCarthy who handled a 4-horse team with the confident ease of a man who had done it so often that it had become a kind of meditation. Lavinia had a window seat and Abel sat across from her, and they shared the coach with a merchant from Albuquerque, a nun traveling to the Santa Fe convent school, and a young couple from Ohio who were going to Homestead near Albuquerque, and who held hands the entire 12 hours with the unguarded intensity of people who have not yet learned to be unsentimental. The road from Las Vegas to Santa Fe was rough and winding, climbing through the Sangre de Cristo foothills and descending into the high desert plateau west of the mountains, and it passed through villages of adobe houses where children came to the roadside to watch the stage, and where the air smelled of piñon smoke and green chili, and something indefinable that Lavinia would later come to understand was simply the smell of altitude and old stone and deep time. She slept for part of the journey, her head tipping toward the window, and when she woke the second time she found that the coach had come through the last pass, and below them, spread out in its shallow bowl of valley with the mountains behind it, was Santa Fe itself, old and small and golden in the late afternoon light, its low adobe buildings the color of the earth they came from. Abel was watching her face when she woke and looked out the window. She did not ask him what he was looking at. She already knew, and the knowing of it sat quietly in her chest, warm and serious and new. Aunt Clara was at the stage depot. Clara Ramires, née Whitfield, was 58 years old, and she had come to Santa Fe as the wife of a trader named Eduardo Ramires 22 years ago, and she had buried Eduardo 15 years ago, and she had built her boarding house with her own hands on a plot of land on the southeast side of the old plaza, and she was one of those women who seem to become more entirely themselves with every decade rather than less. She was small and tanned and had white hair she wore in a braid down her back, and when she saw Lavinia step down from the stage, she walked forward with both arms out and pulled her niece into a hug that had years of waiting in it. "You look thin," Clara said, holding Lavinia at arm's length and examining her with frank concern. "I look fine," Lavinia said. "Aunt Clara, this is Abel Sheridan. He is traveling from Caldwell." Clara looked at Abel with the same frank examination and then looked back at Lavinia with an expression that contained a great deal of information compressed into a small space. "Is he?" she said. "He is," Lavinia said firmly, in the tone that meant this topic was not being opened right now. Clara shook Abel's hand with a good firm grip. "Well," she said, "you are welcome to the territory, Mr. Sheridan. Do you have lodgings arranged?" "Not as yet," he said. "There is a decent place on Agua Fria Street," Clara said, with only a slight additional look at her niece. "I can tell you who to speak to." "I would be grateful," he said. Clara drove them to the boarding house in her flatbed wagon with the trunks, Lavinia up beside her on the bench and Abel riding cutter, who had been loaded onto a stock car in Dodge City and unloaded in Las Vegas, and who was now making his opinion of this entire journey known through a series of pointed head tosses and ear positions that Abel addressed in a low, continuous murmur. The streets of Santa Fe were dirt, packed hard, and the cottonwood trees along the acequia were turning gold, and the mountains behind the town were the deep blue of twilight, and Lavinia felt something she recognized belatedly as happiness, the first solid piece of it she had encountered in a long time. The boarding house was exactly what Clara's letters had described, A long, low adobe building arranged around an interior courtyard with a cottonwood tree and a well. The rooms cool and whitewashed inside, the linens clean and smelling of cedar. Clara had a room ready for Lavinia, the corner room with 2 windows, one east and one south, with a view of the mountains and the plaza in different directions. And when Lavinia set her traveling bag on the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress and let out a long breath, she felt the last of the Kansas dust fall away from her. Clara appeared in the doorway. "He is a good-looking man," she said without preamble. "Aunt Clara, I am just observing." "He followed me across 2 territories," Lavinia said, and was startled to hear that there was no complaint in her voice when she said it. Clara sat down on the small chair near the window with the ease of a woman in her own house. "Do you want to tell me about it?" she said. And Lavinia told her. All of it, from the morning at the wagon to the bench at the Dodge City Depot to dinner in Las Vegas to the stage. And Clara listened with her small, capable hands folded in her lap and her expression moving through various states of interest and recognition and suppressed delight. And when Lavinia finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "Lavinia," she said gently, "I watched you marry a man you thought was safe. I watched from a distance, and I worried about you for 4 years. And then I worried about you for the year after. And now you are sitting in my house telling me that a man who has known you and respected you and waited his proper time has ridden 300 miles to stay in view of you. And I am not going to tell you what to do with that because you are 26 years old and you are one of the most capable women I know. But I will say this." She looked at Lavinia directly. "Being capable and being alone are not the same requirement." Lavinia looked at her hands. "I know that," she said quietly. "Good," said Clara and stood up. "Now come and eat. Chili Colorado and fresh tortillas. The territory will look even better after dinner." She was not wrong. Abel found the rooming house on Agua Fria Street, which was clean and run by a retired couple named Hennessy who kept a good stable for his horse. And in the following days, he went about the business of being a man in a new place with the same methodical, unhurried quality that characterized everything he did. He walked the town. He introduced himself at the livery and at the hardware store. He learned the names of the mountains, the Sangre de Cristos to the east, the Jemez to the west, and he learned that the land in the valley and the foothills to the south was beginning to attract settlement, that there were properties available for purchase, that a man with capital and the knowledge to work land could make something here. He did not press Lavinia for anything beyond the time she offered him. He came to the boarding house every few days, and Clara always offered him coffee and whatever was at hand, and he and Lavinia walked together sometimes in the afternoon along the Acequia Trail, where the cottonwoods were dropping their gold leaves into the water, and they talked, the way people talk when they are beginning to really know each other rather than simply know about each other. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the night she had found Thomas's account books and understood the scope of what he had hidden, about the particular quality of the grief she had felt, which was not only for him but for the version of herself that had believed in the life they were building. He told her about the day his father died, 2 years after he had come west, and how it had taken him 6 months to decide not to go back to Missouri, and how that decision had felt both necessary and like something he was still paying the price for. "Do you miss your brothers?" she asked on one of their afternoon walks, the November air sharp now, the mountains visible in their full detail against the clear blue sky. "I do," he said, "but I write, and I intend to see them at some point." He glanced at her. "When I have something to tell them worth writing about." She felt the pull of that, the deliberate restraint of it, the way he said things that held more than their surface weight without pressing her to acknowledge the depth. She stopped walking and turned to face him, the Acequia running beside them with a soft, persistent sound, the cottonwoods bare now, their pale trunks silver in the late afternoon light. "Abel," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him, at the known angles of his face, at the quiet intelligence in his eyes, at the line of his jaw, and the way he stood with his hat in his hands, because he had taken it off the way he always did when he was listening to something important. And she thought about Aunt Clara's words and her own words on the Dodge City platform about not looking back, and she understood that not looking back did not mean not choosing anything. It meant not retreating. It meant moving forward. And the direction of forward had, over these weeks, made itself clearer than she had given herself permission to admit. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I came to Santa Fe to build something that was mine," she said. "I meant that, I still mean it, and I am building it, and I am not going to stop building it for anyone." "I know," he said, "but I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said on the wagon road outside Caldwell, about staying in view, and I think that you have done that. You have stayed exactly in view and nothing more, and you have not asked for things I was not ready to give, and you have been honest with me in the way that you said you would be, and I need you to know that I see it. I see you doing it." She stopped, because the words were coming differently than she had rehearsed them, more directly, from a lower place. "I would like you to stop staying in view," she said. "I would like you to come closer." Abel Sheridan was still for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, just that, her hand in both of his warm ones, and he held it with a gentleness that somehow felt stronger than anything aggressive could have. "All right," he said, and his voice was quiet and full of something that was not polished or performed but simply real. "All right, Lavinia," she exhaled. It was a long exhale, like releasing something she had been holding since before she even knew she was holding it. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth very briefly and very carefully to her knuckles, and then he held it against his chest for a moment, and the acequia ran beside them, and the mountains stood blue and enormous and indifferent at the edge of the world, and she thought that this particular moment, in this particular light, with this particular man, was something she would carry for the rest of her life. The weeks between November and Christmas passed with the particular sweetness of a thing still becoming, still finding its shape. Lavinia worked at the boarding house every day, learning the rhythms of the operation from Clara, the management of the rooms and the linens and the kitchen, the accounts and the purchasing, the negotiations with the wood suppliers and the food merchants. She was good at it, as she had been good at everything she had turned her full attention to, and Clara was a patient and thorough teacher who also knew when to step back and let her niece find her own way. Abel had taken a temporary position with a ranching operation south of town, run by a man named Hector Solis, a New Mexican born and raised, who ran a mixed cattle and sheep operation with a level of practical skill that Abel found genuinely instructive. The land in the Rio Grande Valley was different from Kansas land, drier and more demanding in some ways and more generous in others, and he was learning its specific requirements with the same thorough attention he had given to everything. He and Hector Solis developed a mutual respect quickly, the kind that happens between men who both understand land and work. On Sundays, Abel and Lavinia had fallen into the habit of spending the afternoon together. Sometimes they rode out into the country south of town, Lavinia on a steady bay mare that Clara kept and lent willingly, Abel on Cutter, the two horses moving comfortably together across the high desert landscape with its red earth and silver sage and juniper. Sometimes they stayed in town and walked the old streets near the plaza, stopping at the market that ran on weekends near the palace of the governors, where the Pueblo people from the nearby villages sold their pottery and woven goods. Sometimes they simply sat in the courtyard of the boarding house in the late afternoon sun and talked, or sat companionably with their reading, the cottonwood throwing its last autumn shade across them. The first time he kissed her was in the courtyard on a Sunday afternoon in early December, when the sky was that impossible deep blue that New Mexico produces in winter, and the air smelled of piñon smoke from every chimney in the city. They had been talking about something entirely ordinary. She could not afterward remember what, and there had been a pause in the conversation, and he had looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, with that direct and honest attention, and she had looked back, and the distance between them had closed by some mutual and unannounced agreement. It was a careful kiss, and a tender one, and it tasted of the coffee they had been drinking, and when it was done they sat for a moment with their foreheads nearly touching and their eyes closed, and she could feel him breathing, and she thought that this was what it felt like when something was right. Not safe in the way that she had confused with right before, genuinely right, the way a thing fits into its proper place. "There," she said softly. "Yes," he said equally softly. "There." Clara, who had appeared in the courtyard doorway with a basket of laundry, looked at them and then looked at the sky with a serene expression and went back inside without a word, which was a masterwork of restraint. Winter in Santa Fe was cold, with snow on the mountains and frost on the courtyard cottonwood every morning, and the boarding house was warm and always full, the travelers who were moving through the territory grateful for clean rooms and the smell of Clara's kitchen. Lavinia ran the accounts with increasing confidence, and she and Clara talked late at the kitchen table some evenings, the oil lamp between them, cups of tea that had gone cold at their elbows, about the business and the future of it. "I want to put a second wing on," Clara said one evening, looking at the plans she had sketched on a piece of paper. "3 more rooms on the east side. The trade is only going to grow as the railroad extends." "You would need a builder," Lavinia said, studying the sketch. "I would," Clara said, "and I would need the capital which I have if I manage the winter accounts carefully." "I can help with that," Lavinia said. "I have been keeping the books in a way that should show you pretty clearly where the room is." Clara looked at her over the paper. "You are good at this," she said. "You know that." "I am beginning to know it," Lavinia said, and meant it. The boarding house felt different from the Baker property in Kansas. There it had always felt like salvage work, holding something together that had already been damaged. Here it felt like building, forward movement, accumulation towards something, not defense against loss. Abel came for dinner on Christmas Day, and they ate in the warm kitchen with Clara and with Senora Hennessy, the wife of his landlord, who Clara had invited because she was newly widowed, and Clara collected strays and lonely people the way some women collect china. There was roasted lamb and tamales and sweet potatoes, and a pie that Lavinia had made from dried apples and cinnamon, and which had come out better than she had dared hope. And after dinner, they sat around the fire and Abel played the harmonica, which Lavinia had not known he could do, and which he did well enough to be genuinely pleasant rather than merely earnest. She sat watching him play, the firelight on his face, and she thought about the morning in Caldwell when she had climbed up onto that wagon and decided not to look back, and she thought about how sometimes not looking back does not mean you lose what is behind you, but rather that it has to ride fast enough to catch up, and sometimes, if you are very fortunate, it does. He had told her he could ride fast enough to stay in view. He had not been wrong. In February, Abel told her he had found a piece of land. It was 22 acres in the Tessouk Valley, about 5 miles north of Santa Fe, with a small adobe structure already on it, and water rights to the acequia that ran along its eastern edge. The land was good, he said, the soil deeper than he had expected in that part of the valley, and the previous owner had planted several apple trees along the south fence that would begin to produce seriously in another 2 or 3 years. He had the money for it if he was careful. He was asking her opinion. She went with him to see it on a Sunday in February, the sky a hard, brilliant blue above the bare fields, the mountains to the east covered in snow to their midslopes, the Tessouk River running small and cold and clear along the north edge of the property. The adobe house was 1 room, solid-walled, with a good fireplace and a low roof that leaked in only one place, which was fixable. The land around it was open and slightly rolling, not flat the way Kansas was flat, but with a gentle geography, a rise toward the mountains to the east and a long view westward toward the Jemez. Lavinia walked the fence lines in her heaviest coat and her boots, and she looked at the apple trees, bare-limbed and patient in the February cold, and she looked at the acequia, and she walked back to where Abel was standing near the adobe, and she looked at the structure and the land around it. "It is a good piece," she said. "I think so," he said. He was watching her with that attention of his, reading something in her face. She turned to face him. The wind came across the field from the west and moved the loose strands of hair at her temples, and she held his gaze in the clean, cold February light. "I want to tell you something," she said. "You can tell me anything," he said. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to rush anything or to create a claim or to change what either of us is building. I am saying it because you have earned hearing it, and because you told me you are an honest man and I am trying to be one in return." Something moved in his face, deep and warm. He closed the few feet between them and took both her hands in his, and looked at her the way she imagined people look at things they have wanted a very long time. "Lavinia Baker," he said, "I have loved you since the spring after Thomas died, when you walked into the county clerk's office to sign those debt papers, and you were so pale and so determined and so entirely yourself that I thought I might not make it through the next 5 minutes without saying something inappropriate." He paused. "I am glad I waited until I had something worth saying." She laughed, which was not how she had expected to respond, but it came up from somewhere genuine and bright, and he laughed with her, and they stood in the cold February wind on his 22 acres of New Mexico Territory land, and laughed together in the way of people who have found something they had not known they were looking for. He proposed to her properly on a warm Saturday in March, in the courtyard of Clara's boarding house, with the first spring flowers beginning to come up in the beds that Clara kept along the east wall. Small yellow things she called chamizo flowers that bloomed early in the protected warmth of the adobe walls. He had a ring that had been his mother's, sent from Missouri by his oldest brother when he had written to tell the family what was happening, a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the light with a dark, particular redness. He asked her. She said yes without the smallest hesitation, and then she looked at the ring on her hand for a long time, turning it in the courtyard light, and she felt the shape of the future arrange itself around her with a clarity and spaciousness that she recognized as the exact opposite of the trapped, diminished feeling that the Baker debts had created. And she understood that this was what Clara had meant about being capable and being alone, not being the same requirement. Clara cried, which she denied afterward, claiming it was the spring dust. They were married in April in the small church on the east side of the plaza, a church that had been serving the community in various forms since the Spanish colonial period, and had the thick walls and cool interior and very old wooden santos that made it feel like a place where serious promises were taken seriously. The ceremony was conducted by Father Agustin, who had known Clara for 15 years, and who took a pragmatic and generous view of the variety of people the territory produced, and who married Protestant cowboys to Missouri women without any visible theological distress. Abel wore a good black coat that he had bought in Santa Fe, and his hat was new, and he had shaved that morning with unusual care. And when Lavinia came through the church door in the cream dress, she had made herself from fabric she had found at the best dry goods store in town, with Clara's silver earrings in her ears and her auburn hair dressed simply up. He looked at her the way a man looks at the thing he has been riding toward, and she felt seen in the deepest and truest sense, not performed for, not managed but genuinely witnessed. They said their vows in the clear, cool April light, and the adobe walls held the sound of them, and the old santos looked on from their niches with their painted expressions of ancient patience, and Clara sat in the front pew with Senora Hennessy and Hector Solis and his wife, and the sound of the small bells Father Agustin rang at the conclusion of the ceremony rang out over the tile roof and into the blue New Mexico sky, and dissolved into air and altitude and light. The spring and summer of 1879 were the most productive and the most content that Lavinia could remember. She continued working with Clara at the boarding house, and the new east wing was under construction by June, built by a local mason named Patricio who knew adobe construction the way Abel knew cattle, with a combination of practical mastery and genuine feeling for the material. Lavinia managed the construction accounts and the disruption to the house's operation with a competence that satisfied her deeply. And she and Clara were developing a partnership that was less teacher and pupil now and more genuinely collaborative. Two capable women running a business together, with the understanding that both of them were permanently invested. Abel had hired two men to help him work the Tesuk land. A young Pueblo man named Diego Tafoya, who knew the valley soil and the acequia system intimately, and whose knowledge proved more valuable than anything Abel had brought from Kansas, and an older hand named Burl who had come up from Texas 3 years earlier and could fix or build almost anything structural. They planted alfalfa in the spring, and a large vegetable garden on the south side of the adobe, and in the summer they added 4 horses to the 2 that already ran on the property and built a proper corral, and a small barn with a hay loft that Abel was proud of, having drawn the plans himself. Lavinia rode out to the Tesuk property most afternoons on the bay mare she had been using since autumn, and sometimes she brought food from Clara's kitchen, and she and Abel ate their supper on the low wall of the courtyard they were building around the adobe, watching the light change on the mountains as the sun went west, and the sky above them ran through its daily spectacular performance. They talked about the property, about the boarding house, about letters from Missouri and the news they were receiving about the territory and the wider world. And sometimes they did not talk at all but sat in the evening quiet with the sound of the irrigation water running in the acequia and the smell of the alfalfa in the warm air. And the ease of the silence between them was the kind of ease that takes years in some relationships, and had simply been present between them from almost the beginning. In August, Lavinia realized she was expecting. She told Abel on a Tuesday evening in the Tesuk courtyard, the summer dark coming down fast as it does in the high country, the first stars very bright overhead. He was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he looked at her, and his face in the starlight had an expression on it that she had not seen before, something beyond happiness, something that went into the territory of awe. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. "If I have my timing right, April or thereabouts." He reached out and pulled her gently toward him, and she leaned against him there in the warm summer dark of the courtyard, and they sat like that for a long time while the stars came fully in above them and the mountains were dark shapes against the dark sky, and the acequia ran its quiet, constant note. "I want to tell you something," he said after a while. "Tell me," she said. "I have not taken a single thing in my life for granted since the morning I rode into Caldwell and saw you standing by that freight wagon," he said quietly, "and I do not intend to start." She pressed her face briefly against the warm cotton of his shirt. "Good," she said, "because I intend to hold you to that." She told Clara the next day, and Clara sat down hard in the kitchen chair and said, with great feeling, "Finally," which was not exactly the response Lavinia had expected, but was entirely characteristic of her aunt. The autumn was beautiful and busy, and she was healthy through it, working as hard as ever, though she let Abel carry things she would previously have managed herself, and she allowed Clara to feed her with an intensity that bordered on a full-time occupation. The boarding house new wing opened in October, 3 additional rooms that immediately filled with the fall trade, and the accounts for the year were better than either she or Clara had anticipated, and they sat at the kitchen table one evening in November with the book spread between them and looked at the numbers and then at each other. "We should put the next improvement into the kitchen," Clara said. "We should put the next improvement into a reserve fund," Lavinia said. "One good year is not a policy." "We should do both," Clara said. "We should do both," Lavinia agreed. Garfield Prout came to Santa Fe in November. She had not expected it, had not in fact thought about Garfield Prout since Kansas, and when she looked up from the boarding house registration book and saw him standing on the other side of the desk in his expensive coat and his tobacco cologne aura, she felt a cold, distinct shock that she controlled in approximately 3 seconds. "Mrs. Baker," he said, and then corrected himself with an unpleasant smile. "I heard you remarried. Congratulations." "What do you want, Mr. Prout?" she said. He was there, he told her, on business. He had interests in Santa Fe now, connections with a land speculation outfit that was moving into the territory as the railroad brought development, and he wanted her to know that there were no hard feelings on his part regarding the Kansas business, and that if she ever found herself in need of capital for the boarding house or anything else, he had associates who could help. She looked at him across the registration desk and felt not fear, which she had half expected to feel, and not anger, which she had expected more, but something closer to clarity. She had paid his debt. She had left his territory. She had built something clean on the other side of it. He was a piece of a past story, and she was in the middle of a present one. "I have no interest in your associates or their capital," she said, pleasantly and firmly. "I wish you good luck in your business, and I hope you will find other lodgings for your stay. I am afraid we are fully occupied." She showed him the registration book, which was in fact full because November trade was strong and the 3 new rooms had changed the operations capacity considerably. He left without particular incident, and she watched him go from the doorway and then went back to her work, and that evening she told Abel about it, and Abel was quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you want me to do anything about it?" "No," she said. "It is over. It was over before I left Caldwell." He nodded. He understood things cleanly, this man. She was grateful for it every single day. The baby arrived in the first week of April 1880, on a morning when the cottonwood outside the boarding house was beginning to leaf, and the mountains had their particular blue and white quality of early spring. And it was a boy, born after a long and difficult night that Clara attended with the composed efficiency of a woman who had seen more than her share of life's major events, and who held Lavinia's hand and spoke to her in a low, steady voice and made tea when tea was possible, and directed Abel to walk in the courtyard when he was too agitated to be useful, which was most of the night. When it was done and the midwife had seen to everything and the morning light was coming in the east window of the corner room, Clara placed the baby in Lavinia's arms, and Lavinia looked at his face, red and furious and brand new, and felt something so large and so complete that it had no adequate word attached to it. Abel came in, his hat in his hands, his face with that expression she had seen under the stars in August, the awe of it. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Lavinia, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "He looks like he has opinions already," Abel said finally. "He absolutely does," Lavinia agreed. "What shall we call him?" Abel said. They had discussed names but had not decided. She looked at the baby's face, that fierce and unfocused newness of it, and she thought about what she wanted for him, what she wanted him to carry through his life. "Thomas," she said, and felt Abel's slight stillness. "Not for the man Thomas was," she said, "for the name of the years that brought me here. Because if those years had not been what they were, I would not be here in this room with you and this child." She looked at Abel, "and I cannot imagine being anywhere else." He took her free hand and held it, and he looked at the baby and then at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "Thomas Abel Sheridan," he said. "Yes," she said, "that." Little Thomas was vocal and strong-willed from the beginning, a baby who did not accept inconveniences philosophically, and who had strong views about sleep schedules, feeding times, and the acceptable proximity of adults. He was deeply loved by Clara, who referred to him as "my boy," with a possessiveness that neither of his parents found it in them to challenge, and by Diego Tafoya, who brought him a carved wooden horse from the Pueblo when he was 3 months old and who taught him, in later years, everything worth knowing about horses and water and growing things in high desert country. The spring of 1880 was a good one on the Tessouk property. The apple trees, now in their 3rd or 4th season, produced fruit for the first time in real quantity, small green gold apples with a tartness that was perfect for pressing. And Abel built a simple press from plans he found in an agricultural almanac, and they made their first cider that autumn, not much of it but good, and shared it with Clara and Diego and Burl and Hector Solis, and his family at a gathering in the Tessouk courtyard in October with the cottonwoods yellow, and the mountains showing their first autumn snow. Lavinia sat at the long table in the courtyard with Thomas on her knee and Abel at her side, and she looked at the people around the table, the faces she had come to know over 2 years of this new life, and she thought about the woman she had been on that Caldwell street in September of 1878, standing by the freight wagon with her back straight and her face forward, and her heart closed tight against anything that might be the next loss. She thought about how close she had come to carrying that closed heart all the way to Santa Fe and keeping it closed once she arrived. She reached under the table and took Abel's hand. He looked at her. "I am glad you can ride fast," she said. He understood immediately, as he always understood the things she said that had layers in them. He turned his hand in hers and held it properly. "I am glad you did not ride faster," he said. In the years that followed, the boarding house grew. Clara and Lavinia added more rooms in 1881, and then a proper dining room that served paying guests as well as boarders, which brought in a different and steadier income stream. Lavinia took over the management almost completely in 1882, as Clara's health began to slow her slightly, though Clara's mind remained sharp and her opinions on every aspect of the business remained fully operational and unrequested. They were partners in the deepest sense, and the business reflected both of them, Clara's long knowledge of the territory and its people and Lavinia's systematic and forward-thinking management. The Tessouk property expanded by 12 acres in 1882 when a neighboring parcel came available, and Abel bought it before anyone else had the chance to think about it. He and Diego Tafoya developed a reputation in the valley for the quality of their horses and the management of their irrigation, and Hector Solis brought other ranchers to look at the acequia system they had developed, and Abel explained it with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely likes to see other people succeed. Lavinia gave birth to their second child in the summer of 1882, another boy, strong and dark-haired like his father, whom they named Edward, for Clara's husband Eduardo, and for the solid, reliable quality the name suggested. Thomas received this addition to the household with the philosophical acceptance of a 2-year-old who has been forewarned, and the complete incomprehension of one who has not yet understood what it truly means to share. Clara held Edward in the hospital room of the adobe that had been enlarged twice since Abel and Lavinia had moved out to the Tessouk property properly, and she looked at him the way she had looked at Thomas, with the fierce and tender completeness of a woman who has had no children of her own and has been given the children of someone she loves instead. "You are going to be trouble," Clara told Edward, who had his eyes open and was looking at her with the same focused suspicion that Thomas had directed at the world on his first day. "They come by it honestly," Lavinia said from the bed. "They do," said Abel from the doorway, and the satisfaction in his voice was the deep kind, the kind that is not performance but simply the sound of a person who is where they are supposed to be. The autumn of 1883 brought a letter from Abel's oldest brother in Missouri, saying that their mother had been unwell but was recovering, and asking if Abel might bring his family east for a visit. It was the first time the question of Missouri had been raised in a real and practical sense, and Abel brought the letter to Lavinia at the boarding house one afternoon and set it on the table between them. She read it carefully. She looked at him across the table. "Do you want to go?" she said. "I want to take you to meet my family," he said, "and I want my mother to meet the boys before he stopped. She is not young." "No," Lavinia said, "of course." She folded the letter along its original lines. "We will go in the spring when the mountain passes are clear and Thomas and Edward will travel better." He looked at her. "You are certain? You are not obligated, Abel," she said. "Your family is my family. Obviously we will go." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that meant he was feeling something he did not have the immediate words for, and she let the quiet be, because she had learned that too over these years, that his quiet was not absence but presence of a different kind. "I told my mother about you," he said eventually. "In the letter I wrote after we married, I told her about the wagon and the freight road and what you said at the depot." "What did she say?" Lavinia asked. "She said," Abel told her, with something in his voice that was humor and tenderness and heritage all at once, "that any woman who makes her son ride 300 miles before she offers him coffee is a woman worth keeping." Lavinia laughed. It was the bright, genuine laugh she had first found in the February cold on the Tessuk land, the one that came from the real place. "I like her already," she said. They went to Missouri in the spring of 1884. The whole family, Lavinia and Abel and Thomas, who was 4 and had opinions about everything, and Edward, who was nearly 2 and was at the age where the world is entirely edible and requires constant supervision. They went by train, the Santa Fe line east through Raton and Trinidad and Dodge City, and then north and east to Springfield. And Thomas was completely overwhelmed and delighted by the locomotive, and spent the entire journey plastered against various windows, while Edward slept with the untroubled efficiency of a young child who has not yet understood that trains are remarkable. Abel's mother, Catherine Sheridan, was a small and energetic woman of 63 who lived with Abel's oldest brother James and his family on the land their father had farmed, and who embraced Lavinia at the farmhouse door with a warmth that brooked no uncertainty. "I have waited 4 years to meet you," Catherine said, holding Lavinia by both arms and looking at her with clear gray eyes that were Abel's eyes. Lavinia realized, exactly Abel's eyes. "I am sorry for the wait," Lavinia said. "No, you are not," Catherine said, with a smile that was also Abel's smile, or rather Abel's smile was hers, and she laughed and pulled Lavinia inside. The 2 weeks in Missouri were warm and full, crowded with Abel's brothers and their wives and children, with the smells of Catherine's kitchen and the green of the Missouri spring, so different from New Mexico's dry, spectacular beauty, all water and shade and dense growing things. Lavinia watched Abel among his brothers, relaxed in a way that had its own specific quality, the relaxation of a person returned to their first language after years of fluency in a second one, comfortable in both but differently comfortable. She sat on the farmhouse porch one evening with Catherine Sheridan, the two of them with cups of tea, the Missouri evening coming down green and soft, the fireflies beginning to appear at the edge of the dark lawn. "He is happy," Catherine said, not as a question. "He is," Lavinia said. "He works very hard and he is very good at what he does and he is happy." "And you?" Catherine said. Lavinia considered it. She looked at the fireflies and the dark lawn and the Missouri sky, which was nothing like the New Mexico sky but was beautiful in its own soft and particular way. "I came to Santa Fe to build something that was mine," she said, "and I have it. And inside that life that is mine I have him and the boys." She paused. "I think I am the most fortunate person I know, and I say that as someone who has also known a different kind of fortune." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I raised him to be worth keeping." "You did a good job," Lavinia said. Catherine patted her hand with a small, firm gesture. "I know it," she said, with a satisfaction so complete that Lavinia found herself smiling for the rest of the evening. They returned to Santa Fe in early summer, coming back through the Raton Pass with the mountains ahead of them, and Lavinia felt the pull of the territory the way she had not expected to feel a pull toward any place after Caldwell had taught her that places can be prisons if you let them be. But this pull was different. This was the pull of home, of the specific smell of pinon and adobe and high-altitude air, of the particular quality of New Mexico light, of the place where her life had genuinely begun. Thomas had his nose against the train window as they came down the south side of the pass, and the plateau opened out below them. "There," he said, pointing at the mountains, recognizing them. "There is home." "Yes," said Abel next to him, looking not at the mountains but at Lavinia. "Yes," she said. Clara was at the depot in Santa Fe when they arrived because Clara was always at the depot when they arrived anywhere, having a constitutional inability to send anyone to do her greeting for her. She was 63 now and had slowed some. though not in any way she would admit, and she swept both boys into her arms with the authority of a grandmother in everything but legal title. The summer of 1884 moved with the golden, purposeful ease of a life that has found its rhythm. Lavinia ran the boarding house with the confidence of a woman who has been doing important work for long enough to know her own competence in it. Abel managed the Tessouk land with a settled and productive thoroughness, and the property was turning a genuine profit now. The horses, the alfalfa, the apple cider that had become something of a local specialty, traded and sold in Santa Fe at the weekend market. Diego Tafoya, who had become as much a part of the operation as any family member, had brought his own family, a wife named Rosa and two small children, to live in the larger adobe on the western edge of the property that Abel had built specifically to offer him. The territory itself was changing around them, the railroad bringing more people and more commerce and more complexity, the old patterns of New Mexico life shifting as the Anglo settlement accelerated, and the land questions that had been present since the American acquisition of the territory became more pressing and more contested. Abel and Lavinia were aware of it, of the injustice embedded in the land grant disputes that dispossessed Hispanic families of land they had held for generations, of the complicated and often brutal machinery of federal and territorial governance that served some people's interests and not others. Abel had seen it in his dealings with other ranchers and landowners, the way the legal system was being used to consolidate land in the hands of men with lawyers and capital, and he and Hector Solis had talked about it at length, Hector's family having personal experience of what that dispossession meant. It was not a thing that could be solved from the Tessouk Valley, but Lavinia and Abel chose the small practical solidarities available to them, the fair wages, the equitable dealing, the boarding house that served all the travelers who came to Clara's door regardless of their origin. It was not heroism. It was simply the decision to see the people around you as people, which is less common than it should be. In the autumn of 1885, Lavinia sat in the courtyard of the boarding house on a September afternoon, the same courtyard where Abel had kissed her for the first time, and where she had said goodbye to Kansas in her heart on some ordinary evening long since past. The cottonwood was large now, its shade wide and golden, the leaves beginning to turn. Thomas was 5 and was in the acequia with Diego's son, doing something that was technically forbidden and completely inevitable, and Edward was 3 and asleep on a blanket near her feet with the absolute commitment of a small child to any project he undertakes. Abel came through the courtyard gate and sat beside her on the low bench, and he was dusty from the road and smelled of horse and sun, and he took off his hat and set it on his knee and looked at her with the expression she had been looking at for 7 years now, and which still had the quality of making the world feel organized and right. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. "Sold the 4 yearlings, got the price I wanted." "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment, comfortable quiet, the kind they had been building between them for years. She looked at the cottonwood and the mountains behind it, the Sangre de Cristos in their September clarity, the early snow already on the high peaks. "7 years ago today," he said, "you told me you were leaving the territory and not looking back." She looked at him. "Did I? September 1878, he said. "I remember the morning very clearly. And you told me you could ride fast enough to stay in view," she said. "I did," he said. She looked at him, at the known and beloved angles of his face, at the 7 years visible in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, at the gray that was beginning at his temples, at the absolute constant quality of his presence beside her, the way he had been beside her for years now, not holding the roof up, not filling the empty space, but simply there, his own whole self in his own right, choosing her every single day the way she chose him. "You were not wrong," she said. "I was not wrong," he agreed, and he reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the bench between them, and the cottonwood moved in the September air above them, And the mountain stood eternal and indifferent and glorious at the edge of the world. And in the acequia, Thomas shrieked with the specific delight of a 5-year-old who has just discovered something wonderful. And Edward slept on in the warm afternoon light, and the boarding house behind them hummed with its productive life. And Santa Fe smelled of pinon and autumn and old adobe stone. She turned her hand under his and laced her fingers through his fingers. The territory was wide, and the sky above it was endless, and the light that fell on the Tessouk Valley and the old plaza and the long mountains was the same light it had always been, ancient and unearned and freely given. And under it, Lavinia Baker, who had once stood by a freight wagon in Caldwell, Kansas, with her back straight and her face forward and her decision made, had built something so entirely and completely hers that it could hold an entire life inside it. A good man and 2 wild boys and a business and a courtyard and a cottonwood tree, and an aunt who claimed not to cry and mountains that never moved and a love so steady and so real that it no longer needed words to establish. Itself only this, the weight of a hand in a hand, the sound of water in an acequia, the light going gold and then amber, and then the first deep purple of a New Mexico evening coming down over the world, and all of it good, all of it real, all of it hers.